Great. Welcome to 15 Minutes with Amerimos Media BookTrib production. Today we are talking with Deborah Santana, who is editor of a new book called All the Women in My Family Sing. Here's the book right here. It's Women Write the World, Essays on Equality, Justice, and Freedom. Deborah herself is an author, she's an activist, she does it all. She has a nonprofit organization called Do a Little for women and girls focusing on health and education. She also addresses sexual violence and healing, which is something that I hope that we'll be able to talk about. And this book has contributions from actress America Ferrera. It's got activist Marianne Wright Edelman and Lisa A. Jones, who we talked about a little bit earlier, who's also a journalist, and she has very, very, very great credentials that go to Washington, D.C. And so many people have advocated for this book, have been talking about this book. You've got actress Alfre Woodard giving an excellent review. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and one of my favorites, singer Nancy Wilson, who also gave a just sterling review of this book. And I am so excited to have you here, Deborah.
So much.
Thank you so much. I want to just jump right into this because this book covers so many different things, and I want people to understand books by Black women are not new. Black women were excellent writers. We write things, but this book for me was, I'm middle aged now. My youth was in the 90s, and we had this book reminds me a lot of if you were to combine Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought with I Dream a World, and you come up with this one. You have women of color, different ages, different backgrounds, talking about the experience. Why is this? And it's Black History Month, so it's also one of those things that has us thinking. Why was this so important and something that you wanted to focus on?
Well, the project began 3 years ago, and my very dear friend Chris has the publishing company Nothing But the Truth, and we were looking at the statistics in publishing, and in publishing, 79% of those who are working in publishing self-identify as white. Hence the lack of diversity in publishing and the lack of interest. Even though there are a lot of titles now that are by women of color, it is really minuscule in terms of the entire publishing industry. So our dream was to publish a book that was written by women of color, edited by women of color. All of the artwork was by women of color. The PR was by women of color. So it was to make an attempt to change and shift the dynamics in publishing.
Oh, great. Okay. And it's interesting to me because I actually did an interview with Patrisse Cullors, who was one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. I did it for a New York Review of Books about a month ago, and that's one of the things that she and I talked about was this underrepresentation of Black women. You have people talking about oppression and oppression of Black people, but it's like that book title, all of the women are white and all of the Blacks are men, and you don't get that don't get that perspective of Black women. Here you have Black women, women of color doing everything, just everything. Yes. But the stories are so vivid. How did you approach the women in terms of getting them to be this naked in terms of expressing themselves?
Well, the call for submissions was to write an essay about what it means personally to be a woman of color in the world today. Mm-hmm. So that's why each essay is so completely different. And the age demographic is from 16 to 83. So we have all of these voices. There are women in South Africa. There are women who are from London. One lives in Paris. And then they live all over America. So the diversity in the voice, the diversity in the lessons and experiences of women of color, the hard-fought struggle to exercise one's right to self-identify as well as to live in their own power. And as you can see from the biographies of the women, they're professors, they're lawyers, they're CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. There's such a diversity that's what we want. That was what we wanted to have.
And let me just give a rundown for our viewers of the different topics that you have, because you really do cover the gamut of topics. You've got essays on the idea of identity, particularly the idea of blackness for Black women. You talk about hair. You talk about politics of appearance. You talk about sexual violence. You talk. One of my favorite stories was I can't remember who the author was, but she said, "I have vacation hair," and I just absolutely love that.
Oh yeah,
because that's something. Yeah, because that's something that if you're not a woman of color, particularly African American woman, you don't get that, because that's what we do. We're about to go on vacation. You get the hair braided, you get it cut short, you do something because you don't know what you're going to be able to do when you're out there. So these different experiences, you organize this in such a way that it covered all the things that were political to us as women of color. Why don't you think we get that anyplace else?
I think that, first of all, in the past year and a half, the country has become more divisive. Before that, I think that people were not aware. We live in a patriarchal white society. And so therefore, people are not exposed to other women's stories, other people's stories, as being rich, cultural, vibrant immersions into what is beautiful. So we want to say, first of all, we don't want to talk about the divisions anymore, because that's being talked enough about in the media. We want to talk about the beauty of our different cultures, and we want to invite people in to read and say, oh, that is either new to me or I have an experience like that. We want to create a dialogue, and we want to create a circle of inclusion instead of excluding. And it's unique in a certain way, because also the whole point of women of color is we all have drops of this and drops of that.
Right.
No one really has a pure heritage, pretty much. So that was really, and the essays are so beautiful.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think it's important, not just for women of color, but for people who are not women of color, to get from this book, is that these are our stories told by us. One of the things that I find oftentimes on social media is that I will express an opinion, being a Black woman, and from my experience, and sometimes I get mansplained. What was it? I think Ari Melber on MSNBC joked about something I tweeted and said, "Oh, you've been white mansplained about something." And my favorite quip is to say, "Thank you for your opinion and for explaining this to me with your 0 years of experience in my shoes." This book, it really speaks to us being in our shoes and telling people these stories from our purview.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are experts.
Right.
Not only are we experts in having been oppressed, we're experts in how to maneuver through life and find success and find our voice and thrive. And that's what we want to talk about, because yes, the patriarchal white world tries to tell us who we are. First of all, that is so egregious. We don't need anyone to tell us where. We want them to listen and have us, our experiences, our wisdom, our truths become part of their domain, their mental and intellectual domain. So you're absolutely right.
There's one, I would be remiss not to address this topic because this is something that I was looking forward to talking with you about. This idea of sexual violence. Sexual violence has been in the media, like, I mean, from October to now, it's just really, really taken over. And people don't realize that the Me Too movement started 10 years ago by an African American woman. And what I enjoyed was, and for some people it was missed, at the State of the Union, you had all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus wearing the Reese pins for Reese Taylor, who was a black woman who was gang raped in the 1940s. And actually, that's how Rosa Parks started her activism, not the bus boycott, but investigating these crimes against black women, particularly in the South. We look at the things that happened to people like Sandra Bland, and those kinds of crimes. But what we haven't really delved into was how sexual violence was used as a form of oppression, particularly for black women in the South.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And
Absolutely.
and how did you go about recruiting women to talk about these particular issues with sexual violence and experience? Because it is difficult. I actually wrote a chapter in another anthology about that kind of experience, and it is a challenge. How'd you get women to open up on that?
Well, first of all, they listen to their authentic self. And when people began writing their essays, and I've talked to a lot of the authors about their process and about their topic, and it came up because it's part of their life experience. And a wound comes up when you're writing. It's going to come up and it wants to be told, it wants to be exposed because it wants to be healed. And one of the essays that I would draw your attention to and the reader's attention to is Carolyn Allen's. And her essay is so powerful. She is a poet, so writing the essay really stretched her because she had to talk about this issue of her being raped by her uncle at a very, very young age, and how that violence traumatized and affected her whole life until she found a teacher who taught her haiku. So it's a redemption story. But all of these stories, and the Me Too movement in Toronto Burke, I respect her so much and love her so much. And you're right, it was 10 years ago. And of course now, because Hollywood became involved, it received a platform that is international. And I'm grateful for that. But those of us who have been through this process and I have a Me Too story, a lot of us have stories because that's the culture, the dynamic of patriarchy and the dynamic of oppression.
Right. And the one thing that we should mention is that the percentage of African American girls who experience some kind of sexual violence before the age of 18 is higher than any other group. And that is something that we don't talk about very much. We also don't talk about it with men in our community. But this book here is one of those things that kind of it takes us out of the shadows. Yes. and puts these things very front and center. But the stories are so compelling. They're just, I recommend anyone read this book because for me, not only in reading some of the essays, and I haven't gone through all of them because some were too painful to actually read at the time, but it did make me want to go back and read books that I hadn't read in years, like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And this weekend, in reading some of these essays, I went back and read the poem from Ntozake Shange for Color Girls, Latent Rapists. I found myself going back to reading that because I was inspired by some of the things that I read in here. So this book does more than just tell these stories. It makes you delve back into the literature of Black women And I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Well, I'm a memoirist, so I believe in the true story. I love story. It's part of, I feel, the path to healing. And I know that fiction is really important because you can actually tell things even more brutally than you want to expose about yourself. But the essays in this anthology, you're absolutely right. Some of them are painful to read, but all of them have victory at the end.
So tell me, is this the only volume, or will there be another one?
I hope there will be another one because there are so many women that weren't involved when we started the project 3 years ago. We just did a call for submissions online and one literary resource. And there are so many. We don't have scientists. I don't really have athletes. I want to, there are so many people. I want to hear Serena's essay.
Yeah.
There are so many other essays that would just expand our hearts and our minds. So we have to market this one, but then after that, perhaps we will have another.
Well, it's Valentine's Day. I know our readers probably won't see this until after Valentine's Day, but this definitely is a labor of love, a book of love. If you love women, if you love women who want to be allies, women of color especially, please give this book to them. I gave the book to my mom and my sister. I ended up getting 3 copies of the book because I bought 2. By accident because I couldn't find one, and then one was sent to me. So I gave one to my mom, one to my sister, who is a professor who she's going to actually be using this in one of her classes. And if you just want to hear if you want to read really, really good, compelling stories, it's called All the Women in My Family Sing, Women Write the World, Essays on Equality, Justice, and Freedom. And I have to stress the justice part, because all of these women, whether the stories start painful, in the end, there is the sense of justice. And you get that from there. Deborah, please tell people where they can reach you, where they can find out more about you.
Well, we have a website, allthewomeninmyfamilysing.com.
Mm-hmm.
We're on Facebook. And of course, I have my own website, DeborahSantana.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for talking with us. And again, All the Women in My Family Sing, go read it. Great book, great writers, just great compelling stories. And I thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.